Well, if you do have a manual, you can open it to page 1. And in page 1, it gives you the list of the basic topics. Now, we are going to try to keep with these, right? You should be able to follow along pretty good. Maybe a first in our history. Okay. But I really believe, I really believe that these meetings are, I don't want to say special, but there is something about them that is going to cause some things even in the spirit realm. That not just because of what you go out and do afterwards, but literally by the preaching of it and by the declaration of it, that it will start to establish some things in the spirit realm. And I will be just very transparent here with you for a second. We've known about these meetings and these series of meetings for some time. They've been on the website, and we've been talking about them. Every time I sat down to really put the material together and bring it out the way that I wanted, that I knew God wanted it brought out, I would make a list, I would look at it and I would go, that's good stuff, but it wasn't it. And if it's not it, I can't preach it. That's just the way I am. It has to resonate, it has to be alive, it has to be more than just information. And so I would sit there and look at it and I think, I've got 3 weeks, might ought to get started, and kind of went through the thing, and I'd look at it and go, that's not it, and so I'd kind of trash it and walk off and be praying about it and walk around and just pray in the Spirit, and then then I'd go back and I'd write something down and it'd be this other thing, and I went through about 5 or 6 complete different revisions on this, and every time looking at it and saying, nah, that's just not it yet. Well, yesterday, didn't come into the office, stayed at home, sat down and said, God, tomorrow the meeting starts. Now, if you want me to know ahead of time, this is it. If not, that's fine. We can, we'll just step up there and open our mouth and expect you to fill it. And he's done that before, so, I don't have a problem with that. But I said, if you want something that people can take home and work from, and kind of, because the manuals aren't just to sell. You understand that we don't just do it, for money. I mean, that's not the point behind them. The manuals are to give you something that you can go home and study out, and hopefully it keeps you moving in the direction. And so I sat down and started writing. And in 3 hours, put together an 80-page manual. And when I got done, that was it. It's kind of like, it wasn't just because I felt like it has to be it, because I could have stayed up till midnight and, wrote 3 more probably, 3 more revisions if I had to. But I really feel like this is, even while I was driving at one point, it was like, you've got to put that in. And so I kept thinking, how's that going to fit? So basically when I sat down, it all came together, and in 3 hours, put it together, and then we had it printed, and then as you saw them bringing in the boxes, that's when we got them from the printer. Okay? That's why we were a little late getting started. We were waiting to get them back. So the meetings today and tomorrow, before we actually get in the main, you can see what all is here, and you can kind of see the direction that it's not just information, it's not just, it's funny because this may be one of the most spiritual meetings we do, and yet it's also going to be one of the most natural meetings we do at the same time, which is the way it should be. Our spirituality should be natural, and it should be a natural outflow of our life. Now, I want you to stop and think about it. As a student of history, I'm always aware of events. And you always look at certain events and you think, and even I think on the first page, if you want to go to page 2. Sound like Paul Harvey. Page 2. Now, see, I'm showing my age. Some of you don't even know who Paul Harvey was. Anyway, okay. That's sad. So, on page 2 there, it says, these are the times and these are the days that the generations to come will be talking about and writing books about. Now, the key is you have to decide what part are you going to play in that. Okay? God knows. He's known ahead of time. But at the same time, it's still your choice. And so We're going to read some of this here in just a minute. But when I was writing this, even when I wrote that statement, I stopped and I thought about it. And I thought, and it's kind of funny because I go back and I look at times. June 18th, 1995, Sunday morning. It was Father's Day. We talked about this actually last Sunday. If you'd have been at the Brownsville Assembly of God in Pensacola, and you'd have walked in like any other Sunday morning. It wasn't any different. There wasn't a different feel in the air. Everything was normal. And they had a guest speaker like they'd had many, many times before. And he was an evangelist. He was a missionary. And he started speaking. And at the end of his missionary talk, he gave an altar call. And people started coming forward. And pretty soon they just kept coming forward. And they just kept coming forward. And pretty soon almost the entire congregation was down front. And God started dealing with people. It wasn't about who laid hands on anybody. It wasn't about getting prayed for. Literally, and I don't use this term often, but literally, people met God at that altar. And it caused something that went on for 7 years almost. And impacted between 2.5 and 4.5 million people during those years. And I don't know if you've been keeping up with what's going on now. Now the church, after the revival, had died out down there. Now the church is in financial problems, and which is many times the way it happens through revival. There's a whole lot of activity, and you have to grow to meet the crowds, and then when it's over, you got big places, and you got to keep supporting them and keep funding them. And many times churches and ministries go into problems afterwards. But it's not for me to judge why things like that happen. It's for specific churches. But if you had been there, if that's just a church you went to, if somebody asked you, on June 12th of that year, what church do you go to? And you say, well, I go to Brownsville Assembly of God. Wouldn't have meant a whole lot. It wasn't famous. It wasn't making a big impact in the city. Just making some impact, but nothing compared to what was going to happen. But there was no clue of what was about to happen. Mm-hmm. And yet, the people walked in that morning. They were thinking the same thing they walked in, thinking every other Sunday morning. We'll be out of here by around noon. I left the pot roast in the crock pot at home. We got to make sure we're there by 12:30, that kind of stuff. I know that goes on, okay? And, they weren't thinking anything special. And yet, looking back, I think they said there was about 1,500 people there at that time, roughly, about that. And you think about that, that means that in the next 50 years, that means there could be 1,500 books written by people that were there, talking about, I was there, I saw it happen, I was there when it happened, and this is what I saw. Because that's exactly what happened with Azusa Street. Azusa Street, they went in there, most of the people that went there, they had heard about some things, they'd moved from a house into a stable that had once been a church, and admitted they were kind of expecting some things because they had heard about a different doctrine that was being preached, but they didn't know the impact. They didn't know that it was going to be literally like the slingshot that slung the Pentecostal message around the world and would start pretty much everything that you see going on, at least in charismatic circles. And yet those people for years after that wrote books, and even little children that can't remember that much wrote books. I was there. I played in the dirt floor. I remember people lying on the ground beside me crying, in mud because of the tears. I've got all the books. Every book I've ever found about Azusa Street, I've got it. And they were all talking about it. And now they're even collecting books about people that were there that knew somebody that was there and the stories that they heard. So, I'm cognizant of beginnings. And I recognize that, as they would say, don't despise the day of small beginnings because things grow. And when I notice things, I don't ever look at necessarily, I look at how it began, but I don't judge the beginning of it because I know the beginning is not the ending. And looking at those movements, I would automatically go back, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I would automatically go back to 1517 when Martin Luther just We have this idea of how dramatic it was when he went up to the Wittenberg Castle and church there and nailed the 95 Theses onto the front door, and that he was making a statement that, and he was driving the nails into the wall, and that it was going to start the Protestant Reformation, which Protestant is a good way of saying protester. Mm-hmm. That's where it came from, all right? But if you think about it, that's where all the public notices were put. That wasn't some unusual thing. That was when you wanted to start a discussion, you wrote it down, you took it over, and you nailed it. It's like a bulletin board, right? It wasn't like he walked up there and was the first one to ever stick something to that door and that it just reverberated all the way back to Rome, the fact that somebody nailed something to the front door. This was a common thing. And honestly, I'm not sure he knew how big it was going to get. But yet, at one point, as you know, if you've listened to me much, I've talked about him before, whenever they said, recant and change your mind, and he said, here I stand. And he made that stand, that you can be justified by faith alone. And from that incident grew basically anything that is not Roman Catholicism. And so you go back and you look at some of these beginnings, and so I just kept thinking about, even as I was writing this, I sat down and I'm thinking about this, and I'm going back and I thought, can you imagine what it would have been like in Jesus' day? I mean, we look at these guys and sometimes we put them on too high of a pedestal. I'm talking about the apostles and some of the other early church fathers. But then at the same time, they deserve to be put on somewhat of a pedestal to a large degree. I mean, here this unknown preacher comes walking up one day and says, hey, leave your nets, leave your tax business, and come with me. And that's a big deal. Quitting your family trade and just taking off across the country following some preacher around. And, by that time they'd already been hearing about this guy that was out baptizing people, this crazy guy that didn't know how to dress and didn't know how to act and didn't know how to treat people and apparently didn't have too good of social skills. All this stuff going on. And they hear about what's going on, and you think, man, this guy's got some guts. Listen to how he's talking to these, these big preachers, telling them he's not going to baptize them until they go back and bring out fruits of repentance. I mean, who is he to decide who's repented? I mean, you got to put yourself there. And so I kind of pictured that whole situation. You got the John, as we call him, John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, however you want to call him. And there he is out there baptizing out in the middle of the wilderness. He's got a crowd. People keep going out. And I just picture this one no-name person standing there hearing about what's going on and going, well, I've always been a good, synagogue goer. I've tried to keep things right with God and hears about this thing going on. So, I think I'll go check it out. And so here's this unknown person just kind of jumps in the crowd and kind of goes out there. But imagine this. This has been going on for 6 months or so, a little while. And then when you get there, you think, you're listening to this guy preach, and you're thinking, well, this isn't normal. I thought this was supposed to happen in the synagogue. I thought this was supposed to happen in the temple. I mean, who is this guy out here in the middle of nowhere? There's no church, there's no altar, there's nothing. There's just, a river running through here. And look how he's dressed. I mean, there is nothing about this situation that would, from any idea of sensibility or logic, would make you want to jump into it. But something he said cut the heart. That's right. And he as he brought it forth, the Spirit of God was behind him. Mm-hmm. And he started saying things. And finally this guy's standing there listening to him and finally just decides, he's right. He's right. I've been, trying to get by on my good works and trying to do everything just right, and I just need my heart toward God. I just need to love God. Come on. And so he finally gets in the line of people that's going down to the river to get baptized, and he gets closer and he gets closer and he gets closer, and it doesn't take real long to just baptize somebody. And the line, he's just kind of standing in line waiting, and walks up to him, and just before he gets there, maybe he's the second or third person back, and all of a sudden somebody cuts in line, just walks right on out in the middle of him. And he thought, hello, fella, the line's back there. I mean, human nature doesn't change, right? They were the same thing back then they would be today. And this guy walks up and he said, oh, but look at it, man, he's paying favoritism. He let his cousin break in line. And so he walks up there and you watch this guy get baptized. And then you hear John talking about seeing this dove coming down and it's all light, and you're thinking, what is going on? And this guy gets up and walks out, and as soon as this man walks out of the water, and he's not heading back toward Jerusalem. He's heading out toward the desert. And he's thinking, there ain't nothing out there, fella. You're going the wrong way. I mean, you're going out in the desert, and you're soaking wet. And so he starts walking that way. But something's changed. Even in the atmosphere. I believe something changed, even in the atmosphere of what's going around. Why? Because, as they would say, an epochal moment had just happened. Something that had been prophesied, as I said in Africa, destiny and obedience had crossed paths. And whenever that happened, everything started to change. The main one who needed to get, or I'd say needed, was supposed to be baptized that day, it had happened. And so now even some of John's own disciples took off after him. And this guy says, I like this guy's message. I don't know who that guy is, but I'll go see what he's got. John's disciples are going after him. So he probably follows at a distance and tries to hear what's going on and hears all this stuff. And pretty soon he's hearing this man tell people, I am the only way to the Father. You think, wait a minute. This definitely should be being said in the temple, because the temple is the only way to God. He had to be thinking. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be one of those people at that time, to hear these words, the things that we take such for granted?
Sure.
Yeah. But for them, it was like Martin Luther. It's all or nothing. If Martin Luther's right, then he's right with God. If he's wrong, he just broke from the only way of salvation, which at that time was considered to be the church. So he was gambling everything on on one decision of being right or wrong. And that's how it was with Jesus' early disciples. They were gambling everything. They had to walk away from everything. If they were right, then they were right, and this will be good. Wouldn't be easy, but it'd be good. It'd be right. But man, if they're wrong, you're talking about family. You're talking about now. You're going after a false prophet if they're wrong.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
You're talking about cutting yourself off from the life of God. You're talking about cutting yourself off literally from the whole, from the children of Israel,
Amen.
From your heritage, from your family. I mean, you would become a heretic in their ideas, an idolater in many ways. And so it was all or nothing. So it was not an easy decision for someone to say, I accept you, Jesus. I hear what you're saying, and I believe your words, and I'm willing to turn my back on the temple, on the synagogue, on all that stuff for any good works or anything at all, and I believe you. And then think about that. I mean, that was a big deal. It wasn't just I'm going to join, Sam's Club. Do I join Sam's Club or Costco? Which one? We're talking about a life-altering, not just life, an eternity-altering decision. And you think, those guys had to think, we're following this guy, something's different, but how different was it? Do you really think that they understood what was fixing to start? Do you really think that they understood the persecution they were going to get? Even in the early days, now while Jesus was there, he kept them protected. They didn't do a whole lot, but he said, once the shepherd struck, then the sheep will be scattered. And that's pretty much what happened after that. And then you have, especially during the book of Acts, the persecution that started. I mean, we don't have any record of any of them actually dying a natural death. I mean, there's, church records that say that the Apostle John did, but that's possibly the only one that we know of. All the others were martyred, killed for their faith. And you start thinking about that. And then we're going to talk about what turned these men from men that were hiding into men that will step out into the street and boldly preach the gospel and go right into the temple. and preach the gospel. Now, that had to be a big change in them. There had to be something happen to them that could cause that kind of change in people. And we all know it was what Jesus referred to as the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So we're going to look at some of these things. But the reason I'm bringing this up right now is because I want you to realize, for all we know, this could be one of those days.
Come on. Come on.
We know from history, and I will show you in the very beginning here, in the next session anyway, I will show you how things started. But mainly about this is how, like I said, with Azusa Street, the Pentecostal movement, 1901, how it started from nothing. It started from somebody preaching something, and it relied upon the people to grab a hold of it and run with it. And I firmly believe that God had tried to get the Pentecostal movement started before then.
Sure.
I believe you can see outbursts of Pentecostal power and experiences all the way through church history, literally for the last 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like if you look at the history of the Israelites, how they would get almost right up to the Jordan and then not make it in. Go around for another, for the whole 40 years. I mean, there's no telling how many times they came near there if you look at their travels and stuff. And how many times God said, are they ready to go in yet? Nope, not yet. Let's try it again. Well, wait till some more die out and we'll see. Well, who are they waiting to die out? The ones that said, oh, this can't be that. We can't do that. We can't go over there. But eventually, the generation that said we can't died. And the generation that said we are well able moved into the promised land. And I firmly believe that that's all God's waiting for, is for a group of people, a generation of people, to say we are well able. Why? Because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We can do this. I was born for such a time as this. Now, I was actually reading something this morning that I thought was really interesting. If you're familiar with a man named, A.J. Gordon. He had a book that was written back in the 1880s, and he talked about miracles of healing. And he talked about miracles of healing throughout church history, and he goes through the whole church history and shows these things happening. And he made a statement, and he shows from history, over and over again, the people say the same thing. You've always got a group of people saying, the power stopped when the apostles died. Well, how many of you know that's still going around? Sure. There's still people out there saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. And yet, throughout history, every time somebody said that, somebody on the other side of that would say, where you find faith, you find miracles. And where you don't find miracles, you don't find faith. And so there was always both sides of that coin, just like it is today. And so when you look at what they did, I really want you to be cognizant of history. I want you to realize a year ago, we talked about the Saints movement. Now this is, and I'm going to show you some history on this right now during the next session actually. But it's really, at some point, you actually have to believe that God knows what he's doing, even if he chose you. All right? And sometimes that's the biggest leap of faith you have to take. All right? I've had people tell me, because of the prophecy that John Lake gave in 34, and people talk about that, and they say, how does that feel? I said, are you kidding me? I said, the hardest thing of faith I ever had to do was accept that was talking about me. That was because the Bible, what Jesus said believers can do, I can accept that. Mm-hmm. But to take a prophecy given by the Spirit of God, but through a man, and accept that and say, okay, what he said there, I have to accept that as for me personally. That is the hardest thing I've ever had to believe.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
Right? And very honestly, it's not made things easier. It's made things harder. Because then once you do say, okay, that could be me maybe. And then as soon as you do that, then you start thinking, okay, let's read this and see who this person is supposed to be and what they're supposed to live up to. And then you start reading that and you think, maybe I don't want that to be me. But at the same time, in your heart, you know where you were heading the whole time. And it's like we tell people, it's easy for a person that's running for president to say, when I'm in office, I will do this, and I will do that, and I will change this. And the person that's in the office at that time sitting there going, yeah, that's what you think. Wait till you get here and know what I know. Because you're just talking until you get here and you open the books and you find out what's actually happening. And then things change, and all of a sudden it's like, well, my predecessor didn't know what he was doing, but I'm going to do things just like him. Because I've read the book that he read. So that's kind of the way people think. Well, and it's just like being a general in the military. At some point, when they pin those stars on you, you actually have to say, you know what? This is who I am. And it's not a matter of conceit. It's not a matter of vanity to think that. It is a matter of fact. Somebody had enough faith in you to pin those stars on you, and you've got to live up to the stars. And so at some point, even in the church, depending on whatever office, if any, that you're called to, everybody, no matter what office it is, at some point they have to decide, God called me to this, this is who I am, and I will walk it out. And it's that simple. And it's not a matter of, now, you can get caught up into pride and vanity, usually because other people kind of push it on you, very honestly. But if you're serious about doing what you're supposed to do for God, then you will fill the position. I don't know if many of you saw the movie Gladiator years ago when it first came out. I did. There's some great one-liners in that movie. What you do in life echoes in eternity. A Christian should have written that. But in that, at one point, Marcus Aurelius, the emperor at that time, is trying to pass the leadership of the Roman Empire onto his general. And, of course, his general did not want to accept it. And he turned around to him and he said, and that's why it must be you. Why? Because you will not use it wrongly. You'll do what needs to be done. You're not going after it. Usually, this is, if you want to live, you got to die. If you want to prosper, you got to give. If you want to be exalted, you got to humble yourself. That's the way it is. That's the way the kingdom works. Yes. It's not the way the earth works. It's the way the kingdom works. That's why one of the first things you look for is find the person that doesn't want the job. Right? The ones that want it the most are usually not the ones best suited for it. So you have to look at these things as a matter of history. I believe with all my heart that a year ago, almost a year ago now, whenever we stood at the conference and we started talking about it, there was nothing. I had not been contacted by ministries around the world saying, Curry, you've got to stand up and declare the Saints movement beginning. Nobody had said that. If I had contacted anybody and asked them, they'd have probably said, well, it needs to be declared, but who are you to declare it? We're going to declare it. Something. All I knew was, I knew by the Spirit of God that I was supposed to declare it. Because it needs to start. Right? Now, we're going to talk about that again, and I'm going to go into some details. I've got to send you to break here, but I just want you to realize, whether you know it or not, every day is a day of history. Today will be history. What kind of day of history is up to us. It really is up to us how much we want to walk with God. And the more you walk with God, the more of a day of history it'll be. But I will tell you this, your plans for your life may be drastically altered by this series of meetings, right? But it's all dependent on how much to heart you take the will and the plan of God, and how much, literally, you can forget about yourself and look at God's will and God's plan and decide this must be done. And when you do that, you won't think about who's doing it. You'll just get busy. And so that's what this week is about. Amen? So let's take a quick break. I'll give you a chance to run now and leave if you're scared. But okay. But we'll be back in just a few minutes. Pick this up.